Good afternoon and welcome to all the participants on CredAvenue webinar on the topic Asset Quality Trends in Retail Loans and Outlook. My name is Vibhor Mittal and I am the Chief Product Officer at CredAvenue. The way we intend to run the event today is that we would start with a small presentation from our side on the topic of interest. The presentation would then be followed by a panel discussion, and we have an amazing line of speakers for you today who've kindly consented to join us on the panel. More on that later. I'll now start with my presentation. So I've divided my presentation today into two parts. The first part is on resilience in retail portfolios. So that we demonstrate through rating transitions that have been seen in pool transactions during the last fiscal. And also why we believe that we are in a better position now vis-a-vis the same time during last year. The second part of the presentation would include asset class-wise performance and outlook for some of the key retail loan asset classes, namely microfinance, commercial vehicles, two-wheelers, secured MSME, LAP, unsecured MSME, housing, and gold asset classes. So coming to the performance of retail portfolios first. So if we keep aside some of the stressed entities, originators, these are entities which had defaulted on their debt post IL&FS crisis, even prior to the beginning of COVID crisis. So outside these entities, we see that only 5 pools belonging to 2 originators in CV and MFI asset class that actually saw a downgrade. And out of these 5 pools, rating of 2 pools was restored back to their original rating level subsequently. No pool witnessed an actual payment default. On the other hand, if you see 41 pools of more than 20 entities witnessed a rating upgrade, either in the senior or mezzanine PTC tranche or in the rated second loss facility, which is available in the transaction. Now, our estimate is that there would be around 500 live pools, and basis that assumption, it would imply an upgrade and downgrade ratio of 8.2% and 1% respectively, which is remarkable given that it was a COVID year. And what we also see is that rating upgrades have outweighed downgrades across all asset classes. And mind you, this is despite the fact that 30% of the transactions start with a AAA rating, and therefore, there's no potential of a rating upgrade in these set of transactions. Now, if you see the performance of pools and compare that with the overall portfolio of the entities, and we did some comparison, what we saw was that the pools have outperformed the portfolios by a collection level of somewhere between 3 to 6% during the last year, probably on account of better pool selection filters. Now, why we believe that we are in a better position as things stand today compared to last year. So one, the lockdown now is less pronounced in both, in terms of both spread and intensity. Most branches of NBFCs are operational, unlike the first lockdown where at least in April and some portion of May, branches were not operational. And the lockdown was also at a nationwide level and more complete in all respects. There's not been any mass migration of labor and borrowers like the previous COVID cycle. We believe that the collection teams at the ground level are far more experienced and better equipped to handle the lockdown situation, including collections through the cashless mode. There's also significant surplus liquidity in the system, and the financial health of the entities is much better in present time. So entities are now sitting on sizable liquidity war chest and also carrying much higher provisions on their books, which will help them absorb any potential losses or collection shortfalls in this year. Another important factor is that there's not been any asset side moratorium that has been announced by the regulator till now. on account of the second COVID wave. And the LM position also for many of the entities are better because of reduced dependence on short-term borrowings and lower disbursements that have happened. On the negative side, though, the impact is this time even seen in some of the rural locations. In the previous cycle, what we saw was it was largely a phenomena that was restricted to urban locations, mostly metros and tier 1 cities. But this time, even the rural economy is feeling the stress. And also another factor that has played out is that the operations of some of the lenders has been impacted because a lot of staff has got infected by the various and therefore is not available for a sustained period of time. Now coming to the asset class wise performance, and I'll start with the microfinance loans first. So here, we saw that the performance improved for this asset class significantly in H2 of last fiscal, something which is true for most of the asset classes. However, in April, there is a dip. So collection efficiency has at a portfolio level declined from 94% to 85%. Now, many of the entities had actually collected the April installment before the second COVID wave hit significantly, which happened during mid of April. So May collections, we believe, will be much more impacted and collections may drop to somewhere around 60% in this asset class. But after that, we should start seeing some gradual recovery happening from the month of June and then much sharper recovery starting to happen from July onwards. I mentioned earlier that this time the stress is even there in rural areas, unlike the previous cycle. In terms of states, we see that Maharashtra, Assam, West Bengal, and Odisha, these are some of the weak performing states in the portfolio. In terms of disbursement and AUM growth, so disbursements saw a degrowth of around 26% year on year. However, the AUM of the portfolio at an industry level still saw a 4% growth. Now, the data that we have collated actually comprises of the clients, which are active on our platform, as well as some of the listed players whose numbers are there in the public domain. So we see that, AUM did grow by a modest 4% despite a significant dip in disbursements. And this was aided by several factors. So one, that there was moratorium applicable on a large portion of the portfolio for at least some period of time during the last fiscal, due to which the amortization in these portfolio was much lower. Similarly, around 2.5% of the book was restructured, where again some principal moratorium would have been offered. Also, what happened is that a lot of disbursements happened towards the end of the year in Q4 of the fiscal, and therefore again the impact on AUM would be positive on that count. These set of loans would not have amortized much by the year end. The gross NPA level stood at around 3.3% as on March 21. We expect disbursements and AUM growth to be healthy at around 20% and 15% respectively in the current fiscal of the low base effect. The gross NPA levels, we expect them to inch up slightly, and they may be in the region of 4 to 5% as on March 22. Coming to the commercial vehicle asset class, the collection efficiencies, they were very, very strong in Q4 of the last fiscal. The collection efficiency numbers have dipped to around 75% in April. One trend that we've seen in the underlying portfolios is that light vehicles have outperformed medium and heavy vehicles. And similarly, what we've also seen is that performance of passenger vehicles and vehicles in the commercial segment, that has been weaker. One key risk in this segment is the high diesel prices, which will adversely impact the viability of the vehicles because the fuel prices have gone up significantly in the past few months. We expect collections to bottom out at around 70% in the month of May, and then inch up from those levels subsequently. Disbursements saw a degrowth of 20%. However, the AUM of the entities saw a 5% growth. Our expectation is that restructured book is to the extent of 1.5%, and the gross NPA was at around 6.7% for the industry. The expectation is that the gross NPA levels could remain elevated and may end at somewhere between 7 to 8% as on year end. Coming to the two-wheeler asset class, so this is an asset class which was particularly resilient in the first COVID cycle. Various factors aided the same. So one, the significant portion of the portfolio is in rural locations, which was less impacted. Monsoons were good, and then also, there was pent-up demand during festival season and need for personal mobility during lockdown. That aided growth in the sector and the performance of the sector as a whole. In the month of April, collection efficiencies have dipped to around 85% level, which we believe will marginally dip further in the month of May and then start picking up from there on. In terms of disbursements, there was still a degrowth of around 20% in our portfolio of entities. But the AUM grew by around 12%. The gross NPAs stood at around 4.9%. We believe that gross NPAs could inch up marginally and may end somewhere between 5 to 6% as on March 22 in this segment. The restructured book is almost negligible, and again, we see that entities are sitting on most of the entities are sitting on good liquidity, and average cash balance is around 14% of the AUM here. Now, coming to the secured MSME segment, here what we see is that collection efficiency dipped in May 21. However, or expected to dip significantly in May 21, but after that it will start improving. We believe that collection efficiency could come down to 70% before improving from those levels. In terms of disbursement and AUM growth, so disbursement growth was around 10% and AUM growth was 4% in the last fiscal. Gross NPAs were subdued at 2%, partly aided by some restructuring that happened in this portfolio. Our expectation is that restructured book could be close to 3% of the overall book. And the performance of this book and the losses that emanate from this portion of the book, that is something that one will need to see. In terms of NPA expectations, we believe that NPAs will remain range bound in the region of 2 to 3% as on March 22, which will be a function of how much incremental restructuring that happens, how much is the incremental AUM and growth, and as well as the write-offs that happen during the course of the year. Now, coming to unsecured MSME, so this is an asset class which is significantly underperformed in comparison to other asset classes, where the stress is quite visible, and our expectation is that the stress will continue for the remainder of this year as well. So collection efficiencies have dipped to as low as 65% in April. We believe that they'll bottom out at around 60% at a portfolio level and then improve slightly from those levels. In terms of disbursement and AUM growth, so that was 7% and 5% respectively in the last fiscal. What is important to note here is that almost a 12% book has been already restructured. So this number is very, very high, and the performance of this portion of the book will need to be watched very, very closely. We expect the gross NPAs to increase from 5.5% to around 7 to 8%, despite significant write-offs in this year. Last year also the write-offs were very high at around 5%. However, these entities, again, most of them are sitting on a good amount of liquidity. average cash as a percentage of total AUM is as high as 20% in this portfolio. Coming to the performance of housing loans next. So what we see is that this asset class, obviously the performance has been very, very strong, largely on account of the fact that there is sentiment that is attached to the collateral, and largely the underlying mode of repayment is cashless, which has aided in 95% plus collection efficiencies from June 20 onwards. Salaried borrowers, the performance has been better compared to the self-employed borrowers. We expect again, collection efficiencies to come down a little bit in the month of May, but after that, there should be improvements. In terms of disbursements, the degrowth of almost 24% year on year, but AUMs saw a modest increase of around 3%. Gross NPA was around 2.4%, around 1% of the restructured, 1% of the loans actually got restructured, largely in the developer portfolio or the self-employed lab portfolio. Disbursements and AUM growth, we expect it to be muted at 3% and 6% respectively in the current fiscal, and we expect gross NPA levels to be again range bound in 2 to 3% kind of a range. Finally, I come to gold loans as an asset class. So here, what we saw was that the performance was obviously very, very strong in the last fiscal. What we saw was that the gold prices inched up sharply during the course of the year. Due to which, while in tonnage terms, NBFCs saw a 6% decline, but the AUM of these entities actually went up by 24% due to higher ticket size. However, another thing that happened is that banks actually gained market share from NBFCs in this segment significantly, because there was a lot of push from their side to disburse gold loans, considering the perceived safety that is seen in this asset class. The gross NPA levels were around 1.8% at the end of the last fiscal. The numbers would have been much higher because there were significant delays in auctioning the collateral in the first 3 quarters. But in the fourth quarter, we saw a good amount of auctions happen, which brought back the gross NPA levels under control. We expect the performance of this asset class again to remain strong during the course of the fiscal. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. So if you have any queries on the presentation, please feel free to reach out to us. I would now like to invite Karthik Srinivasan for moderating this session and introducing the other panelists. Karthik himself needs no introduction. He's been associated with financial services industry for a period of more than 2 decades now, and he's the head of group head financial sector ratings at ICRA. He's also a member of the rating committee at ICRA. Before we start, one important housekeeping announcement. Participants would have an option to ask questions from the panel members by submitting the same in the Q&A chat window. Please keep the questions coming and do not save them for the end of the session. Karthik shall pick up some of these questions and get that addressed during the course of the discussion itself. Karthik, over to you.
Thank you, Vibhor. Good afternoon, everyone. So after the detailed data intensive presentation by, hello. Yeah, so after the data intensive presentation by Vibhor, stage is basically set for the engaging panel round with our key guests. They're all stalwarts in their respective areas, and it'll really be great to hear their views in the current situation and the way ahead. Today on the panel, we have Dr. Kalpana Shankar, MD Belstar Microfinance, Mr. Rangarajan Krishnan, CEO 5-Star Business Finance, Mr. Amit Genda, CEO Avance Financial Services, Mr. Anil Mehta, MD CEO India Shelter Finance, and Mr. Abhijit Bose, Chief Credit Officer at DCB Bank. Vibhor did allude to all of you all to put in the questions on the Q&A window as and when convenient. He probably didn't realize that there's already a lot of questions already there for him. So what I think I'll do is I'll start off with the panel discussion. Vibhor, you stay around. We'll probably have you answer some of those questions related to your presentation after we have a panel members speak. So, the first wave of COVID took everyone by surprise, say last year around this time, March, April. If it was the first wave last time, this time it's the second wave which has taken us by surprise. More so, if we were to just step back and recollect by Feb or March, we were all looking forward to FY22 as possibly a year of resurgence. And then suddenly come April, we were all still grappling as to, is this again going to be a slow, painful year for all of us? As Vibhor showed in his presentations, the initial set of data does suggest a drop of collections in April and May, but they're not as severe as one saw the numbers for the same time last year. In other words, we still believe that the asset quality related uncertainties really persist for the sector. But at the same time, from a broader economy or an BFSI sector, what provides us some comfort is the adequate liquidity profile of most of the underlying players. So if we believe that the economy revives sooner, it'll be a fair assumption that most of the lenders would be able to navigate through this phase as well without any mishaps. But if the recovery gets delayed, then there could be some stress on some of the borderline entities. So with this backdrop from my end, let's hear what our guests' view are on the assessment of the current situation and how does it augur for FY22. Let's start off with the MFI sector, a sector which has seen volatility. A lot of investors have heightened anxiety levels, especially during such events. So, Kalpana ma'am, if you could share your perspectives, especially in the light of the first COVID cycle, the rural economy and geography were less impacted. How do you see the situation now, especially in the rural economy, as well as the borrower profile that one caters to?
Thanks, Karthik. As already reiterated, in the first wave, only urban areas were affected. The business and collections picked up gradually in the second and the third quarter, and we reached pre-COVID levels in the last quarter. We were able to control asset quality and the write-off. But the second wave has impacted rural areas, and coupled with lockdown, the asset quality is getting stressed. Current PAR 30 is hovering around 10%, with both the clients and family members being affected. But the only silver lining which I see is that agriculture sector has not been affected by COVID, and 60% of our clientele is from the agriculture sector. MFIs predominantly, the loans are used for working capital and not for fixed assets. So definitely MFI as an industry, we can bounce back if vaccination drive picks up and if there is no further lockdown. We are optimistic we can restrict our write-off to 1.5% to 2% if things improve.
Okay, so that's a fairly comforting number that you expect the overall losses to be at less than 1.5% for this year. Let's move to the next segment of small business loans. Again, a segment where one expects some shock, given that this is a broader segment that has been adversely impacted over the last 12 to 15 months on account of the pandemic. There have been various measures by the government and the regulator to provide liquidity to this sector. To answer this and more, let's move to Mr. Rangarajan Krishnan. So how do you see the impact of the second wave on the small business loan sector? concerns that, do you expect this business to survive? And which subsectors or which businesses do you see are more protracted to slow down and are possibly under greater stress?
So thank you, Karthik. One point I would like to clarify, which you rightly asked, is that we as a business, we finance small businesses which are run by individuals. So we are not into MSME lending. We don't finance enterprises to that extent. So I think my observations could be a little bit different from probably a player who is focused exclusively on financing enterprises. But as far as small retail businesses are concerned, this wave is a little different. Like Vibhor rightly pointed out in the beginning of the session, this wave had a telling impact on the rural economies, and 95% of our branches is between tier 3 and tier 6 cities. So in the first wave we were benefited by it, but in the second wave I think the number of people who got impacted, both our employees and the customers, is probably in the range of at least 1:4 ratio between wave 1 and wave 2. And obviously that's a huge magnitude of people who got affected, and that had a telling impact both on the physical and psychological impact on people. But I think the good part is we hope we have crossed the peak in wave 2, and most of the sectors are slowly bouncing back, at least the small businesses. I think the businesses which are particularly showing some stress or will take a lot more time to come back is any business which is related to hotels and eateries, and any business which is sort of linked to personal travel related businesses, which includes your agencies, travel agencies, cab owners, school van drivers, auto drivers. I mean that the whole host of people who are involved in personal mobility. I think that is definitely going to take some more time to get back to normalcy. One other thing which may not be that intuitive, but we are seeing that as part of our portfolio, is that people or families which were dependent on foreign remittances, maybe they could have family members who are settled in the Middle East or wherever they are, in the form of laborers, and they used to regularly remit monies to India. Those families are definitely seeing cash flow issues. So I think if the underwriting was largely based on remittances as a main source of income, yeah, I think they will take a little more time to get back on their feet. I would say the last sector which we expect will take a little more time to jump back is people who are cash salaried and employed as casual laborers across the variety of factories and MSME units in the country. They will take a little more time to bounce back. Okay, thanks, Nanda. Any sense on what's the credit cost or losses that you estimate from this business? Yeah, I'm going to restrict this answer to Five-Star alone and not to the sector. Our long-term expectation of a credit loss in this business is somewhere between 0.5 to 1%. I don't think in the last 20 years we have ever crossed this. We have strong, belief that we will be within this range, even across this wave. At the end of wave 1, our gross NPA stood at 1.03%, with actually nil restructuring. So we didn't have any restructuring. So we faced the wave fairly well. These are fundamental businesses. So our hope is that they're very, very resilient and they will find the first instance an excuse to bounce back to normalcy. And that will pick up from an asset quality perspective. So we are confident that history will repeat itself. That's good to know. So basically you're saying is good underwriting and cherry picking. Yeah. Customers should help keep credit costs under check, irrespective of what kind of lender one is talking about. Correct. Great. Let's move to another segment, education loans. Last couple of years, we've been hearing quite a bit of interest on education financing, education loans in the with more players entering this segment, either as a standalone business model or as a part of their overall offerings to the borrowers. So we will hear from Amit Kenda. Amit, what's your view on how has this segment behaved during the pandemic? And since we are seeing a lot of interest in this segment, what's your estimate of let's say a market size and the opportunity on education loans in the country?
Thank you, Karthik. First of all, I think it's very difficult to follow Kalpana and Rangarajan. They've raised the bar. So my congratulations to both you and the CredAvenue team to choose a very, very strong panel. it definitely makes my job more difficult in whatever I'm going to say here today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I've been with Avance for about 17 quarters. We are India's second largest education financing non-banking finance company, which is very, very digitally agile and wanting to make a difference by empowering deserving students. That's what our purpose of existence is all about. We've been in the business since 2013. We did go through management change where Warburg Pincus came in 2019 at 80% and IFC stays at 20%. I think the market, if I have to give you a larger view, to many people, surprise is almost as large as 1 lakh crore. And if you see from 2017, the CAGR is at a 7% number. Last year, the same number, and I can quote CRIF here. This is a report from CRIF, which says 99,000 crores of assets under management across various banks and non-banks, with market for the financial year 2021 growing at almost 3.5%. So a little less than 4%. Non-banking finance companies all put together have a close to 10% market share, just tad short of 10%. So high single digit, and clearly the growth rates remain reasonably attractive. At an overall segment level, there have been legacy issues in this portfolio at the industry and segment level, where loans below 10 lakhs, specifically loans below 4 lakhs, historically, for a variety of reasons, have not performed too well. The industry report also guides us very clearly to say loans greater than 10 lakhs at a sectoral level are performing stupendously well. So happy to share with you the entire sector loans are sub 50 bips on GNPA for all NBFCs put together. This is for loans greater than 10 lakhs. My own view and outlook here is very, very simple. Education financing, I believe, is a secular growth story. The geopolitical issues, whether it was the change of government in the US earlier, there were a lot of questions. What will happen? Will visas get restricted? Will students be able to travel because of the pandemic? Whether it was wave 1 or wave 2, I personally believe are all temporary phenomena. This growth and this segment and sector is here to stay and get built in a very, very robust manner. And there are various reasons for that, Karthik. Look at the demographics of India, stupendously supporting the whole story. Look at the way the growth is coming in across the sector, whether it is banks or non-banks. I also believe that credit, despite the pandemic, will continue to perform very, very well. So let me give you a broad visibility to how it is worked out for us. Restructuring has been low single digit. Bouncing remains medium single digit. GNPA remains sub 100 bips. And like I said, we've been in the business for 7 years. COVID was a real acid test. And I think we've stood well. Not only we've stood well, the entire sector has stood well. And my whole hypothesis here is that if your underwriting is backed on good credit, it will perform well. So whether you take MSME loans, the common theme that we heard was, are you doing right underwriting or not? And those who've done right underwriting historically have done better. So our entire premise on underwriting in the segment remains on the potential of the student. Which university is the student going to? What course will they pass out? We have 60 plus variables that we look at underwriting. Leveraging a scorecard that we've created, we are able to process this in a very, very agile manner and turn around our loans in as early as 3 to 5 days across most of the segments. I also believe that the whole noise that is there is some noise, let me accept that first, on job losses overseas. Let me give you a data from COVID wave 1 and wave 2. COVID wave 1 saw global large impact and India also some impact. Wave 2 now in India is seeing a very, very large impact. Very unfortunate what we saw on the loss of human lives. But if I have to give you some data, unemployment in US back then, April 20, was roughly 15%, a little short of 15%. Today is at a 6%. Majority of our portfolio within the student lending business is for US and within US is STEM and MBA, where job losses are a low single digit. In fact, the demand for these have grown. So we believe that we will get an advantage. We will actually get a tailwind on account of this. Just to give you a data point, my new application, student interest to go overseas in terms of logins and sanctions, is a surprisingly 120% growth, even despite the pandemic. I believe that we are on a very, very good foothold, and we'll only grow from here. The growth could be moderated, muted for Q1, moderated for Q2, and then I believe there will be a strong impetus. That's my belief. Even last year, Avance, when the sector grew by 4%, 3.6%, Avance grew in this segment alone by 14%. So that's it from my side. Happy to take any more specific questions that you want me to cover later or now.
So Amit, just to follow up on this, if I was to do a simple comparison for any other NBFC lending, wherein you are studying the cash flow and the business profile today, unlike an education loan, where to sort of put it very, very bluntly, it's a punt on the student, his or her ability to complete the course at a very, very good score, and also get a job, a good paying job for them to repay the loan that I've taken from institutions like yours. So how do you sort of manage and still ensure, I mean, not only Avance, but we've also seen the private sector NBFCs, have been able to keep the credit cost very, very low in this segment?
Sure, Karthik. So Karthik, the only area where I would beg to differ from you, I wouldn't call it a punt. It's a science. Okay. And I'll tell you what I mean by it. I did briefly mention we look at almost 60 variables before we take the decision to say yes to an application or even no to an application. It's a reasonably scientific approach at the back. What allows us to win and where are we different is our specialization, Karthik. So I strongly believe whether you look at any segment, globally and India, companies who've done specialization go deep, go wide, may not go wide, but definitely go deep. And when you go deep in assessing your credit correct, your understanding of your white space customer segment, and then going deep in credit is correct, then you are allowed to create a differentiated value proposition both for the customer and of course create stakeholder value in the process. Now, let me illustrate to you. We have over 10,000 plus universities courses ranked, not only by what Google says, but to actually say what is the employment ratio for students passing out from which course and which university. So there is a clear science to back behind it, and we continuously work on updating that in a very, very close manner. Do we look at the conventional underwriting? Yes. So will we do KYC? Will we do naturally by law? We'll do that. Will we do bureau checks? Will we apply all kinds of necessary for ratios, fixed obligation income ratios, so on and so forth, where it is from current income? Of course, we'll do all of that. We will do all of that. But there is a deep science behind us going and looking at variables, which allows us to scientifically predict the future income. You'll be surprised, Karthik, our portfolio now has been there for 7 years. Average door-to-door maturity, like I said, I don't think I covered it earlier, sorry. Our door-to-door maturity is about 4.5 years, little less than 5 years. Even 36 MOB book on a static pool has never exceeded 100 beeps of GNP. After COVID as well. I think data speaks for itself, and I'm not saying this only for Avance. I would invite people to look up at the industry data that is available. I think a couple of us who are running education-focused financing companies are trying to create the sector and segment. And I believe that if you underwrite the asset well, this is a great business to be in.
Great. Thanks, Amit. I think let's move on to the next asset class, affordable housing. So, Mr. Mehta, affordable housing has done reasonably well last year during the first wave of COVID. Second wave, does that concern you? Because most of the affordable housing players are present in the semi-urban rural areas, and we are seeing a sharp rise in the positivity rates and also the mortality rates as far as the country is concerned. Do you see that impacting the sector asset quality?
Look, mortality risk largely we cover through insurance, right? So there is credit life which covers mortality risk. And to an extent, generically in our risk evaluation methods, lifetime events are built in. You know, marriages will happen, people will fall sick, etc. But nobody can build for a catastrophic event like what happened last year, what's happening again this time. Last year, lockdowns were strict. It was complete stoppage of everything, but we still bounced back within about 4 or 5 months. We were back to almost normal, and March we peaked at 103% collection efficiency. But well, come April, we have this again. I think portfolios will resile. They will come back to normal. It may take a shorter or longer time. The only joker in the pack is the fact that people who had to borrow to restart their businesses run out of capital again. So this is a second blow. Apart from you were wiped out of capital, small businesses like say restaurants, their working capital is in raw material. That raw material, because of the sudden lockdown, all got spoiled. That working capital was written off. They restarted through their own sources or through borrowings. And if this time it again means a complete write-off of all of that, there will probably be a lower proportion of borrowers coming back. But what I find a lot of comforting and reason for optimism for is that one, our collateral sales are not taking a hit on value of collateral, right? Collateral sales are still happening. People have interest in purchasing properties. We continue to get new applications. So it will be a blip. I think in the longer term, maybe 2 years from now, we will look at it as a blip. But at this time, certainly. But the first round gave us a lot of, building of strength in the balance sheets. We provided very conservatively. So there is a lot of provision sitting in the book. There is a lot of collection expertise which got developed in that time, because almost the whole FTE of the company was deployed to collection. So now everybody knows how to collect. So suddenly you can, and because you are mobile enabled because of the first round, it's easy to, it's very portable for people to move from sales to collection and collection to sales. So this time again, almost 70% of our population is in collections, and acquisitions have not yet restarted. There is a degree of terror, for the want of a better word, in the mind of people, because our sales model is pretty much FOS, face to face, on street kind of model. So, and I think it would be a bit unfair and maybe tough to force people to go out at this time. What we are trying to do is put in incentives and so on to give people opportunities to make money, insist everyone gets vaccinated. And we are saying a funny thing, though most of our sales force is educated, there is a significant vaccine hesitancy. 30% of people in our metro branches do not turn up even when we've organized, we are paying for the vaccine. We are paying for employees, for their families, but there's a 30% dropout rate on people either not taking an appointment or not keeping the appointment to take the vaccine. So there will be a degree of fear for at least, I think, 60 more days. So hopefully, as lockdowns ease, at least in the northern states, most of the states have now extended till the 15th of June, though there is some nominal relaxation. But still, we don't see people out on the road. So that is the only hurdle. Apart from that, I think in spite of losing April, May, and part of June, I think we will still be able to meet plan. Unless it goes into July and July gets wasted, we will still be able to meet plan in 3 quarters that we would have done in 4. So we had planned for 4, but I think even with 3 quarters, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that unless something big hits again, we should still be able to meet plan. On asset quality, I don't have much fear. I think we will come back down to normal. There doesn't seem to be an issue as of now, unless a third wave happens, which is significant, and again, lockdowns are imposed and all sorts of stuff happens. But I think as the vaccine speed goes up and more percent of the population gets vaccinated, hopefully we should be all right in the next quarter or so. We should be doing okay. So I don't see a big fear either on meeting business numbers, because though what you have shown is very surprising in the presentation of the asset growth, AUM growth being very low single digits. Last year we grew 50% on disbursements. This year again we plan to grow 50%, and I have no reason to believe we will not be growing 50% as we speak today. It's important to put that caveat on everything that each time one opens their mouth. So I would put that caveat, but other than that, I don't see a lot of, there are a lot of, always when you look for pessimism, there are 105 reasons to feel pessimistic. But I think there are 210 reasons to feel optimistic too. So if we sort of convey the optimism, if we are able to sell our people on the optimism and see rooms for growth in the market, I am pretty much in Ranga's camp of saying, there is a lot of good yet to happen. Liquidity will increase, inflation may go up, but liquidity will increase, businesses will go back up. So I have every reason to feel, cautiously optimistic about what's going on rather than desperately pessimistic.
So with due respect to Vibor's presentation, that's more of an industry number, and there'll always be outliers, both on the positive as well as the other side. Fine. I think let's move on to the next panelist. This is from a bank's point of view. Abhijit, you've been part of DCB Bank. Wanted to have your perspective. Retail portfolios historically have been or demonstrated resilience to various credit events in the past. Is COVID different? We still believe that most of the entities, the underlying businesses managed through COVID-1, but is COVID-2 different? Which subclasses do you get more concerned about, as a lender to those institutions, or when you directly lend to those underlying segments?
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. It's a very interesting question. I mean, I've been listening to my other colleagues from the industry, and I'm getting a lot of good insight. And the best part is that I'm getting a lot of positivity. I mean, that's giving me a lot of confidence, because I think most of us who are there in the group are interconnected in some or the other way. My opinion is that self-employed per se, a segment is a very resilient segment, and in the past also they have shown that resilience. Be it a DMON, be it GST, and especially when I'm saying self-employed, I'm talking about the smaller businesses, not very large businesses, because their ability to bounce back, their ability to quickly figure out or restructure the way they do business, they're able to control cost and so on and so forth. So that makes them quite adaptable to the situations. The problem here in COVID, which is like not there in while it was DMON or a GST, is that this just came. I know people were just completely unaware, and it has hit the entire world. And there is a lot of I would say people are they are not only worried, there's a lot of uncertainty. The uncertainty makes people nervous. So that is what is different as far as this is concerned. But having said that, first wave, April to June 20, especially RBI coming in and giving relief programs, giving moratorium, and other actually I would say that the government and also RBI, they had they've made huge amount of efforts in terms of bringing various reliefs, I would say in a timely manner, to ensure that people are, like for example, the first set of moratorium, it was needed because at that point in time, I mean, the businesses were closed. I mean, the shutters were down. I mean, there was no revenue, revenue for that matter for the customer to earn and then give installments to the banks and the financial institutions. But at the same time, moratorium, to my mind, is not a very good way of helping a customer. If possible, we should ask customers to keep paying, because not only it adds up to the loan in terms of interest mounting and the principals going up, but also it's a question of habit. So that is quite important, and I guess the RBI and also government realized that, and the second time they have not resorted to moratorium. Rather, they have come out with restructuring. The only problem I see in that restructuring is that MSME restructure, for instance, earlier, if person has been given, he never knew that is going to hit by the second wave, and he had projected his cash flows, and suddenly comes 31st March 21st was the last day of restructuring, and by 15th April the guy was hit by another wave. He wouldn't know what to do, because whatever he had committed, say for instance he was supposed to pay 100 rupee installment, and he negotiated with the bank for say paying 75-80, and now that 75-80 also was a question mark. I think that is where I think maybe RBI should look and see if those customers can be done a second restructure without downgrade, because that's important. I mean, they didn't know what's going to hit them. And I'm sure there are additional measures which are coming. So to my mind, coming back to the resilience part, yes, they are resilient, and timely help coming from the regulators, from the government, would definitely help these guys to come back. I wouldn't see. The only thing is that now at this juncture, the financial institutions and banks should be cautious, and maybe planning a little bit of calculations they should do while restructuring, keeping in mind that there could be possibly a third wave. As we hear that end of this year we might. But to my mind, the amount of vaccination which is happening, and I think that we should be fine.
Just an add-on, you spoke of restructuring. What is your sense in terms of, in the first phase, the expectations was a lot of assets might have got restructured, but finally the numbers quoted by banks, by various other lenders, NBFCs, MFIs, HFCs, barring few players, the systemic restructuring numbers have been significantly lower than initial estimates. Now you have a restructuring window for another 6 months. Do you expect the overall restructuring numbers to sort of go up this time around?
I wouldn't feel so, because in the first time itself, the percentage of restructuring which has happened is more or less the customers who were affected and impacted. They kind of have resorted to restructuring. But as I said, that there could be a case of reconsidering restructuring those customers again, because earlier restructuring terms, actually the second wave has completely has made it haywire, and the customers don't know really what to do. So I wouldn't say that the percentage of customers resorting to restructure would increase, but I definitely would say that, yeah, some of them, yes, but definitely say that I think we need to we need to kind of consider a second time restructure of those customers.
Okay. Quite a few questions have come up on the Q&A chat box by the participants. Before I move on to that, Abhijit, one question for you.
Yeah.
We've been hearing a lot of buzz over banks and NBFCs, scaling up the co-lending model, and that seems to be or at least being talked about as a game changer going forward, both in terms of collaboration for doing business as well as reducing the liquidity woes for many of the NBFCs. How do you see this arrangement or this proposition? How do you see that changing the landscape for the Indian financial markets?
Okay, yeah. So I would say the revised recent co-lending model, which has come out, which RBI has allowed, I think it's a very, very positive step. It's a very, very positive step, because the co-lending structure which was available earlier in 2016-17, that was not very practical. But the model which has now been approved by RBI and has been allowed is a very, very very practical model. It not only addresses to the priority sector, but also RBI has given clarification that it is also for non-priority sector. That's one. Second is, I would tend to believe that in this model, the NBFCs, HFCs, fintechs, uh, the point I'm making is that they are focused in a particular segment, right? They know that segment. They usually, you will see NBFCs or HFCs, they are in one product and they go deep into that product and they develop some kind of expertise, and not only expertise but also they're deep rooted and they know the market. And I would tend to believe both the partners, be it the banks or the NBFC stroke fintech companies, they can play to their strengths, and this model will actually be a win-win for both of them. It will be win-win for both of them, and I genuinely believe that this will be, it's a beautiful model which will evolve for all the stakeholders.
Okay, thanks, Arvind. Let's move on to quite a number of participant questions. Kalpana ma'am, a question for you. How are MFIs, which are present in states like Maharashtra, West Bengal, Assam, which have been showing some weaker collection numbers? How is one operating in those segments? What new approaches has a lender have you initiated to deal with this crisis? And a more generic one in terms of, the field touch factor seems quite critical for MFI. So how is one managing that part and sort of focusing or improving on the non-cash collections part of it?
Yeah, to answer your questions, a couple of points. The role of SROs is also very critical. Right now, they have been organizing a lot of training programs, issuing advisories for solving problems. I think they have to lobby with RBI and ensure that all the people working in this section, they have to be a part of the code of responsible lending. Only the NBFC MFIs actually subscribe to it, but banks, SFBs do not abide by the norms of two-lender norms. So there is a lot of the space is overcrowded. Maharashtra, it was difficult for the last several months, but now last 1 month, things are really, it has opened up and the collection efficiency is dramatically improved in states like Maharashtra, West Bengal. We are not facing any stress. But RBI, we are all mandated by RBI, and especially after the second wave, a lot of data is sought by RBI. So when we are governed by RBI, that message should be loud and clear to the states, like it is mandated by RBI, and states shall not impose further instructions or come in the view of RBI's governing domain. So if states issue specific instructions like what's happening in Assam, the industry, we as practitioners, we are really affected. So I think RBI should ensure supremacy, and somehow RBI's mandate should prevail. Regarding the digital, I think that is going to be collections is going to be a very important forward factor going forward. Even last month, we were analyzing, our team somehow has managed to record a 68% collection efficiency. In the south, it was close to 79%. So more predictive analysis on consumer behavior and investment in IT will definitely improve. But at the same time, as is a unique asset class, we are dealing with the poorest of the poor. So to assess their cash flows, their liquidity, their needs, we have to have that customer connect is very, very important. So I think we need a hybrid model where we have to invest in tech, go digital, And when currently it is 5 to 10%, I think that by the end of the year, all of us will see 70 to 80% digital collections going forward, because it is a safe for the clients as well. But we have to have the customer connect also, because that is very crucial for the sector. Only then we will be able to serve and give them the right products that they need, and also ensure that they are not over-indebted.
And just a follow-up in terms of, you did share during your earlier comment that the credit cost for Belstar is likely to be subdued or low at about 1.5%. Do you expect at a broader sectoral level also the numbers would be under control, or do you see a far higher number at a sectoral level in terms of credit cost?
I think by and large, if the vaccination picks up, then it should be around the same level. Each player has it depends on the leadership and their knowledge of the state actually. So for each state, we have to have a specific approach. So it depends upon your knowledge of the sector, how you follow up, how you use data to even guide your team. All those things are very critical. But if the lockdown ceases and the vaccination improves, the numbers will be universal across the sector.
Okay, thanks. Amit, couple of questions have come for the education loan business in terms of, is one seeing increased competition from banks into this segment? What's your take on funding students in the K-12 segment? You are obviously in the higher end segment as of now, the degree and postgraduate courses. And in general, again, education loans, institutions have been facing challenges with lower fees and schools not open, work from home, or study from home. So any thought on stress as far as school portfolios are concerned? I know you're not into the school lending, it's more of education loans to students, but any perspective on that?
Sure, Karthik. So Karthik, let me just put this in perspective. Actually, we have three big segments where we operate. So I spoke about student loans earlier because that was the larger question, and that is the largest pie in the market, which I also sized up at about 1 lakh crore. We are also present in student institutional loans and in the digital business. I think somebody asked you the question on K-12 as well. So let me try and answer this one by one. I think it's a set of questions you've really asked me. Is competition going up is your first question. Answer is yes. So anybody who's wanting to create category and wanting a share of retail lending in India should be prepared to deal with competition constructively. Now look at housing. We have stalwarts here with us today, but you look at the entire sector. You look at Aadhaar, you look at Aavas, and there are so many others, right? Where were they 5 years ago? Look at the way the sector's grown. So are banks growing? Answer is yes. Are non-banks growing? Answer is yes. My own belief, why will non-banks grow faster than banks, or at least some of the non-banks grow faster than banks, is their ability to go deep. Where do non-banks begin? Non-banks begin where banks finish pretty much. Frankly, that is where our parameters start, right? So not only do we have the deep skill set in sourcing, but in servicing. And servicing includes everything: risk, collections, credit, operations, you name it, end-to-end servicing. Abhijit was talking about why he believes that segment-specific NBFCs in co-lending could do well. So I'm connecting the dots here. So that's my answer to your first question. We are simply put seeing competition go up, and we are very happy to see that, because it means we continue to enhance our value proposition proactively. Digital business. Now that's very, very interesting. EdTech in India. So everybody's seeing what is happening in India in EdTech, right? We have all seen the likes of what has happened to Byju's or White Hat Junior and so on and so forth. Happy to share with you that we are also present in an EdTech business. So a combination of education and fintech. This business alone, we've acquired more than 50,000 customers despite the pandemic last year. 3 years, Karthik, 12 months, If I may say so, we've actually delivered nil losses in the business. And this is the average tenure of the business is only 11 months. So it's a fully rundown business, Karthik. If you select credit well, and if you create a customer proposition, nobody wants to default on their child's education fees. Let me make that bold statement. That is the last category of default people will want to make, other than, if I may say so, also their housing asset class. So if I wear my old hat of collections, which is the first installment a customer will default on? Typically, housing and education will be top priority for any customer who doesn't have an intention issue naturally. So we work with almost 100 partners in the digital business. Simplilearn, Edureka, Vedantu, Akash. We work Unacademy, Byju's, Upgrad, Topper, Jigsaw. I can go on. We also work with very respectable large marketplaces there. We work with Credence, we work with Propelled, we work with GreyQuest, and I can continue naming a few more. It's a sweet business to be in, and I also believe that the opportunity here will be very, very large. The third part of your series of questions for me, if I understood it right, feel free to interject me if I'm missing the point, Karthik, was that how's the education institutional loan portfolio performing? Again, I believe education is secular growth. I will maybe sound repetitive here in saying, but this is a non-discretionary spend. Has the pandemic impacted this part of the balance sheet? Yes, this is about 25% of our total asset. Primarily, we did the white spacing very, very sharp. We don't work with colleges. We actually work only with K-12. Portfolio is very, very granular. Sub 1 crore ticket size. Varies generally tier 3, tier 4, tier 2 towns from 20 lakh, 50 lakh rupee, where school is taking for either investing in capex, putting capex expenses in setting up the infrastructure, and or wanting to upgrade their digital, which is where the growth is primarily now coming from. Happy to share with you, our restructuring again in this business was medium single digit, and our GNP in this business was again less than 100 bps. These are all reported numbers, so I can share here as well. Why we don't do any unsecured here, we do only secured. But the premise of credit in this business is not secured or unsecured. The premise is underlying cash flow. If the cash flow is correct and if you've underwritten it well, again, we use an internal scorecard, like I was mentioning earlier. If it satisfies, then we meet the application requirements. And we believe, again, there is a COVID impact. I think here demand is naturally muted because of the lockdowns, which many of my fellow panelists and colleagues also spoke about. However, my belief is that we've seen collection efficiency. By the way, I think that was also one of the questions that came. I was quickly eyeballing the chats, questions there. Our deterioration is in the range of 100 to 200 beeps here on collection efficiency at a bankable asset level. I also believe that these are inherently high EBITDA businesses, ranges from 25 to 30%. OPEX, they've resized very well. COVID-1 taught them to OPEX resizing. They demonstrated resilience, which again, a lot of people spoke about earlier today. They've cut OPEX as high as 50%. And running expenses also gone down, which means the inherent underlying strength in the business, the cash flow lying in the business, the non-discretionary spend. So even with less than 50% revenue coming in, the credit is performed very, very, very well. At least that's where we are in our experience around it. Unfortunately, here I don't have the bureau data to quote because bureau doesn't tag this segment and sector separately. Last point I would say here in support of what I'm bringing out as a narrative is the following. I think the governmental support that came in. So whether it was the moratorium, whether it was the restructuring, all the support that the government extended here by way of ECL GS 1.0, which later on even got extended, played an instrumental role in supporting the customers during this time, because the severity in lockdown wave 1 was also very, very high. So my final submission here is the strong credit underwriting framework and extension of ECL GS 1.0 and beyond that is coming, has allowed the entire industry largely to do well. Those who've gone deep in their underwriting skills and their collection skills have done well. So I'll give you a data point. There are only 3 areas where I was doing CapEx investments, 3 or maybe 4: collections, risk, credit, and digital. And like Anil said, we've also deployed a significant portion of our rest of the workforce to focus on the bottom line. It's worked out stupendously well. In fact, I know some people will wonder how come you have only medium digit restructuring and low single digit NPA. Let me tell you, the restructured pool last 24 months, never in OD was only 5%. Sorry, other way around. Only 5% of the pool that we restructured as a balance sheet had ever been in OD for prior 24 months. So it is not that an account was just restructured. The credit was looked at, reassessed at an individual application level before we extended. And we continue to closely monitor how are our restructured assets performing. So we hold good view to the segment. Again, Q1 will be muted clearly. It all depends on how the vaccination drive unfolds. But I think India's done we can all choose to be cynic, but I am an eternal optimist. And let me state this, from going on 1.3 dose in beginning of March to where we've reached on 15 doses on every 100 people, I think we've done a reasonably fine job as a country, and I'm hopeful they'll do even better here on. And if the vaccination drives unfolds strongly, then I think we have a very strong coming back as a nation. Look at US, let me take 3 global examples, and I will not take Israel. We all know what has happened in Israel. Look at US, look at Canada, look at UK. All 3 would have vaccinated anywhere between 85 to 95 as in doses per 100 people. That would be the broad range. And people are back. Schools have opened up. Malls have opened up. In fact, in lighter vein, let me tell you, even casinos have opened up. Not that I gamble, but that's a discretionary spend. That is luxury, right? Whereas schools, colleges are not luxury, are not discretionary in nature. So I think it's a matter of time. India inherently will come out. And Indians as a community have always been very, very resilient. Very, very, very resilient. In fact, that is one reason why we stood tall, even in wave 1. So why we may be going through a low as a country, but I think we will come out strong out of this. Better informed human beings as well on what not to do. Back to you, Karthik.
Yep. Mr. Mehta, a couple of questions on addressed to you. One, in terms of the growth outlook for the affordable housing sector, is the whole dynamics moving from metros to non-metros and rural areas over the next couple of years? So do you see the entire action on affordable housing moving towards the non-metros, and competition from banks? How do you see that impacting either the growth rates or the asset quality for the segment?
Well, I think, there is no question of action moving from one kind of city to another. There will be action all over because we continue to reproduce in Australia every year, right? So underlying thesis of our business is, of course, the population growth, but the bigger fundamental thing which will go on for a long, long time in this country is the urbanization. And post-pandemic, a lot of people will realize that you can't have schools and hospitals and all the other public facilities in 500,000 villages, right? So people will be tempted more and more to go towards bigger agglomerations. As of the 2011 census, if I remember the number correctly, there were about 428 towns which had population of 150,000 and over. 150,000 essentially supports an HFC business, right? So if I take that cutoff, that number is expected to have grown by almost 40% in the new census. So imagine having 600 odd towns, 700 odd towns, where you've got a growing population, you've got people coming in from surrounding areas, and imagine the explosion in services. So I think this will only accelerate. The pace of urbanization is only going to accelerate. It may be to tier 3, tier 4 cities, tier 2 cities, tier 1 cities and metros. It will happen everywhere. People will graduate to living in bigger cities. The guy who lives in Jaipur aspires to live in a Bombay or a Delhi or wherever. So I think there will be a filtering up of a large number of people. In the immediate next 5 years, I don't think any government, whichever government is in power, has an option but to spend its way out of trouble. So that is bound to happen. So you will see it's completely agnostic to who is in power, which party comes, but we will have to be spending a lot. And as you spend, incomes percolate down, you will see a lot of housing activity. So I see tremendous potential for affordable HFCs, and those of us who get our act right, and like Amit said, if we can control our OPEX, because fundamentally, as businesses get more and more sort of commoditized from a pricing perspective, really speaking, the juice is to be had in risk management practices, underwriting, and your OPEX, how closely you can control and monitor your OPEX. And last year, what good it did to larger companies and smaller companies like ours is to give us the opportunity to relook at OPEX line by line and to actually generate substantial savings and reduce wastage in the company. So last year's belt tightening is standing us all in good stead. I think the aggression to source loans, because the single biggest cost is the sales cost in any loan economics, unit economics of a loan. The single biggest cost is the sales cost. At least for us, it's true, and it's true for a few other companies which we have benchmarked. If we can reduce that through digital, which is an uphill climb, very tough to close, especially a housing deal, through digital means. But if whoever can crack that first, and whoever can crack it economically, will emerge a fast and sure winner, is my understanding. Risk management, of course, is a given in our businesses, all our businesses.
Rangarajan, one, how do you see the changes in the collection infrastructure, either at 5-star or at the industry, because of the COVID? And second, your thoughts on, do you believe that the ECLGS scheme is basically deferred recognition of NPAs, and they are bound to hit us on our face, say another 12 to 18 months down the line?
I don't want to answer the second question. You put it too bluntly, so maybe we can have an offline chat. But as far as the first question is concerned, yeah, companies like us, we have always felt that the means of repayment by a customer, whether it is digital or cash, we should go with the customer's choice rather than forcing a customer to do something that is convenient to us. So as a company, we have 70% cash collections. We still have 70% cash collections because our customers earn by cash. While they all have bank accounts, but these are not transactable bank accounts. And we have so far stayed true, to just staying with whatever customer likes. And every time there is a crisis, there is a sharp, peaking which happens in digital payments. But quickly it comes back to normalcy and it settles around 60-70% of cash collections always. So I don't know if this is going to change even this time. In COVID-1, we saw, the digital collections for 5-star moving up from 30% to almost 70% during those, heavy lockdown days. But once things started easing, we are back to, cash collections to the way customers prefer to do so. So while digital collections will always be something which we will enable a customer to pay in any means and, ways that he wants. But we will leave the ultimate choice to the customer from a collections perspective. But I think that's always something that we will strive to do in terms of which is making sure that anything which is convenient to the customer, we are not blocking the door, and he should be free to do what he wants to do. But that apart, there is a lot of tightening in the credit process itself in underwriting. I'm sure every company is tightening its processes, whether it's underwriting in particular subsegments of the way that they do. or its overall ratios monitored in terms of LTVs and DBRs. There is a lot of learning which has happened over the last 12 months, I would say, and that's hopefully going to keep us in good stead from a collections perspective as well.
We've significantly overshot our time, but there are quite a number of questions. Maybe I can just wrap up with one to Abhijit. It's a question which is a bit tricky in the sense, there's always this fear amongst the analyst community or investors. Does evergreening happen, and how much of that happens? So instead of asking that question to each of the other panelists, I thought, Abhijit, you would be a better person because one, you are lending directly to the sector, and you're also lending to the other panel members who are there in the session today. So your thoughts on, how bad, or is it more of a noise around evergreening of books by lenders?
Okay, so a difficult question, yes, but I may want to address this differently. So let us see. See, we have at best 10% customers who are delinquent, and 90% customers are absolutely fine, right? They're paying in time. So now question comes: is the 10% customers? How do we address their needs? Now, if you see in the current scheme of things, where the Reserve Bank themselves have come out with so many, it's a long helping hand. It's come with so many schemes where customers can defer their payments. Customers can you can create an FITL if it is a OD or a cash credit. If it is a installment loan, you can increase tenor. If it is an MSME, you can restructure. So the question of evergreening doesn't come. There is no reason why would there be any evergreening in this current scene of things. But otherwise, maybe it all depends on the institution, because with the kind of regulations around and the kind of people who are in this lending business, and especially professionals very much there in the helm of affairs, I don't think it's a usual practice. I don't think, but yes, of course, there will be on and off in pockets where you would see that, but I don't see it's a trend. I wouldn't see it as a trend, and especially in the current scheme of things where you have so many alternatives available, which is being allowed by Reserve Bank of India. I wouldn't see evergreening any person resorting to that kind of activity.
Thanks, Abhijit. This, in any case, remains a tricky question where people will have their own views. It's really difficult to change that. But on that note, I guess we will come to the end of this panel discussion. There are quite a few other questions also which we've not been able to take today. I would request Vibhor and the CredAvenue team to possibly get back to the participants with answers to those. Vibhor, over to you for the closing remarks.
So big thanks to Karthik and all our speakers for taking up time for the event today and sharing their insights with the participants. I'd also like to convey our gratitude to everyone who joined the call today. We look forward to your continued participation in future CredAvenue events as well. With this, we'd like to call it a wrap. Thank you.